Welcome to Breadboarding. In the previous video we managed to get Microsoft Windows 103 running on the Breadboard PC, and this is video 62 of the Breadboard 8088 PC, and in this video we're going to be trying to get the PS2 mouse and Windows 1, 2 and 3 running. This is a review of the high level plan. The early stages, the Nanocomp 8088 was a basic computer with a 7-segment display, keypad and a monitor program to allow a certain amount of testing and debugging. We then extended this into a basic floppy disk PC with a monochrome display adapter video controller, PS2 keyboard controller, floppy disk controller, and we're able to boot early copies of MS-DOS, and we got MS-DOS 330 running. And then this stage we've built out an IDE disk controller, booting MS-DOS off the hard disk, and then spent quite a bit of time getting a CGA video controller working. So this is a color graphics adapter compatible with the original IBM CGA video controller. Previous video we got Windows 1.0 running. Then in this one we're going to get the PS2 mouse running and see if we can run Windows 2 and Windows 3. So a bit of background on the mouse first of all. So the first mouse was Douglas Engelbart 1964. I think this is a picture from the museum where this is actually located. Then in the 1970s then the Xerox Alto had a 3-button mouse. Then the Apple Lisa in 1983 I think also introduced a mouse. Microsoft introduced the PC serial mouse from around 1983. And there's also a PC bus mouse, so this didn't use the serial port, it had a dedicated bus mouse port in the back of the PC. Then around 1987 when IBM introduced the PS2 range, then the PS2 mouse came in, and this would be the starter connector, the mini DIN connector that you may have been familiar with on PCs up until USB really replaced all of this. So PS2 was superseded by USB and Bluetooth, although you can still get USB to PS2 converters. So these types of converters will take one of your standard keyboard or standard mouse and make them compatible with the older PS2 standard. So the design on the Breadboard PC for the PS2 keyboard and mouse came from Sergei Kislev's XI8088 design. There's a couple of things to notice about this, is that the address line going into the keyboard controller wasn't A0, it's actually A2, so it meant that the port addresses for the keyboard controller was 60 and 64, so that's something to watch out for if you're doing this. And we can see here that the mouse used the interrupt 12 line, so also sometimes known as the auxiliary port. And we can see on the mouse port that it's pin 1 for the data, the mouse data, pin 5 for the clock. And the XI88 design allowed both PS2 and AT keyboards to be used, but in this particular case we're only interested in the PS2 version. And the other thing just to note here, the display select here, so the port P16, so that's port 1 pin 6, was also display select, so this was actually used to switch between monochrome display adapter and color graphics adapter CGA. So at the moment this will be set at 5 volts, which enables the CGA card. And you can see down here that the pins that we're using for the mouse here are P22, P23, not being confused with pin 23 and pin 24. So when looking at this we have to be quite careful to make sure we don't get the port 2, pin 2, port 2, pin 3 and the 23 and 24 mixed up. Now if you have a look at the schematic in KiCad, so I've just been going over this to make sure that I haven't made any mistakes. So if we look at the mouse data we can see that that is P22 on pin 23, and if we check against the data sheet for the keyboard controller just to make sure, so we can see here that the mouse data comes out of port 2 pin 2 and the feedback goes into P11. So if we just check that, yeah, so P22 and the feedback here goes to P11, so that's correct. And for the mouse clock It's from P23 and the feedback goes to T1 or test 1. And for the clock is P23 and the feedback for that goes to test 1. So it looks like those are okay. One other thing just to note is the reason for these pull-up resistors here is that because the keyboard and mouse tend to have open collector outputs, if you try and put any sort of logic analyzer on these, then unless there's something pulling the pins up to 5 volts, then you won't actually see anything on the logic analyzer. So I put these 10k resistors in here just so that when I need to look at things, the logic analyzer, I don't think the keyboard or the mouse is dead. So what other things do we need to do to enable the mouse? Well, there's a couple of things. We just need to make sure that the interrupt 12 is actually connected properly. So I'll make sure I've done that in a minute. We need to enable the mouse aux port support in the BIOS. So there are two settings. There is a defined PS2 mouse and there's also the extended BIOS data area which need to be configured, and we need to reassemble the BIOS and burn that into the BIOS EPROM and make sure we put the XT IDE BIOS in the right place as well. We're then going to need to install the Microsoft DOS mouse driver. And then to get Windows 1.0 working, Windows 1.0 came out before the PS2 mouse was supported, but apparently from other sites, if you copy the Windows 203 mouse.drv file and replace the one in Windows 1.0. So if you then rerun Windows Setup and select the Microsoft Mouse Bus Serial option with the updated driver, then that will actually support the PS2 mouse. So just have a look at the section of the board where this is located. So you can see here that we've got, this is the keyboard and mouse controller. We've already got the keyboard port in there and you can see that has got the purple connector on there. Then we've got the mouse port there as well, and I have a genuine PS2 mouse here. So this is one I bought off Amazon a year or so ago, but this has got a standard PS2 connector on there. If we want to, if you don't have one of those, it is possible to get one of these sort of USB to PS2 connectors. These used to come with older mice. When the first USB mice came out, they used to come with these. So I've got a couple of these. You can also still buy these, I think, on eBay. So just have a look at the BIOS. So this is the output, the listing of the BIOS, and we can see here that at the moment the PS2 mouse is commented out, as is the extended BIOS data area. So what we need to do to enable this, just need to go to the config file, then down to where we've got our Breadboard PC section. So what we're going to do is to comment back in the PS2 mouse, comment back in the extended BIOS data area. So this is an area of RAM that's needed for the PS2 mouse aux support to work. So we just need to save that. We'll then go to a command prompt. We're going to make the BIOS again. Okay, so we've got a few warnings but no errors. So that's just where the BIOS is being padded out. And if we now have a look at the BIOS listing, so have a look at the updated listing file, we should then be able to find, yep, so these are commented in now. And if we search for where we've got the PS2 mouse in here, we should see that we've now got, yes, there's some messages there to do with the PS2 mouse. And we've also got the code in here now is actually there for reading the aux port, the auxiliary port, which is the mouse port. So what I need to do now is to program the BIOS EPROM. So I'll do that in a minute, and then when we come back, we'll hopefully plug in the mouse and see whether or not we can get it working. Okay, so I've put the EPROM, BIOS EPROM in the programmer. We're just going to read it to make sure that it's in properly. Yeah, so we can see that we've got the IDE Universal BIOS will actually be located in the first 4K, which goes down to 100 hex on the side, and then we can see the Breadboard PC 8088 BIOS is then from 1000 onwards. So when we load this, we just have to be careful that we load the XTIG BIOS, which has been configured using the configuration utility. So there should be a version of this in the DOS folder. IDE Tiny, so this was modified in November when we last made changes to this. So we're going to load this, and this can actually clear the buffer, so that's fine to leave these as defaults. So this should have loaded in the XTE Universal BIOS, and then what we need to do is to load the rest of the BIOS in from 100 and make sure we don't fill the rest of the space with FFF. So now we're going to change this to, from a start address 100, and we're going to disable clearing the buffer, and then we just need to browse to our updated BIOS code. So this is the one we've just compiled today on the 1st of January. Happy New Year, everyone. So we're loading it to 1000. We're not filling anything else with FFFs. There we go. So we can now see we've got our 8088 BIOS. If we go down the bottom, so at 7FFF we have the end of it, and we can see here that we've got the instructions that basically say to jump to the cold start code after a reset. So we can just program that now. Okay, so I'm just going to put that back in the board, power it up to make sure it's still working, and then we'll plug the mouse in. Okay, so I'm just going to boot this up, powered it on, just to see whether or not the BIOS comes up and DOS starts. So you can see here maths coprocessor absent, display and PS2 aux device absent as well. So at the moment I haven't plugged in the mouse, so that's what we'd expect. And that's started up into DOS OK, so it still seems to be okay. So now all I need to do is to go in and plug in the mouse. So we have it. Just going to plug the mouse in. So the mouse is in, so we're just going to reboot that now and see whether or not it detects the mouse. So mouse is showing as absent, so I need to look into that and see what's going on. So in fact I power cycled the Breadboard PC, and in fact on the reboot it did actually detect the PS2 mouse. So you can see here PS2 aux device present. Let's just have a look what we've got on the disk here. So I've got a number of mouse drivers on here. I have tried a number of the Microsoft ones, but I'm going to try the Qt mouse one, so that's CT mouse here. So if you go to CT mouse, this is part of the FreeDOS distribution. So I'm just going to run CT mouse, and that has installed. Now just to test this, there is actually a utility provided with CT mouse. So if we do mouse test, and you can see the top right hand corner of the screen. So as I move the mouse around, you can see it's actually changing. When I actually press enter, you can now see there's actually the sort of mouse cursor moving around, and then there's various other options it's got. So this is not actually showing the mouse pointer here, and now this is showing the mouse pointer. So you can see here that that appears to be working. So I know at least that the hardware is working here, and there's various there's 8x8 character cells, 8x14 and 8x16, which don't really show on this CGA adapter. Okay, so that appears to be working. Now there's another test, so Norton Editor. If we go into Norton Editor, and this actually shows that you can see here that the menu is working with the mouse. In fact, on the options over here, you can see there's mouse options here that we can actually enable this and to change the various delays and things. So that would indicate that we are actually getting things to work with this. And if we were just to open a file, We just look at autoexec.bat, for example, just shows that we can go around here and we can select things and all that sort of things we'd expect to be able to do. So it shows that the PS2 hardware is working, and it certainly works with the CT mouse. However, I have had some problems trying to get the Microsoft mouse drivers running. So what I've also done is I screenshotted the BIOS parent screen here, because the first screen tends to disappear a bit too quickly. And what you can see here is, now that I've enabled the extended BIOS data area, this is actually an area of memory which actually goes at the top of RAM. So we can see here that we've got 512k of RAM, and the extended BIOS data area is the top 1k. So the available conventional RAM is 511k, and it's also found the XT IDE BIOS extension ROM at F800 before it boots off the IDE drive. What I've also done is I've reconfigured Windows 1.0. I went into the setup utility, and this time I chose option 2, which is the Microsoft mouse bus of serial, and I've copied the Windows 203 mouse driver into Windows 1.1. I had problems running the Microsoft mouse drivers, so I've actually ordered an old Microsoft PS2 mouse from eBay, so that will hopefully be arriving during the next week or so. So what I'm just going to show you now is just going to go back into Windows, and we're going to have a look at the different Windows versions. So Windows 1 here, if we run this up, this has actually now got the mouse support. So you can see that there's actually a mouse cursor. However, the cursor doesn't move when I move the mouse around. So you can see here we've got the pointer in the middle here, but the mouse doesn't actually move around. And if we just go into the menu here, we can go into end session. If we go into Windows 2, we're at Windows again here. So you can see this is Windows 203. And again, we have the pointer here, and you can see it doesn't really look too much difference. Difference visually between Windows 1.0 and 2.0 is not that great. There are a few differences. You can actually overlap windows rather than just tiling them. And if we look at the menu here, you can see that a lot of these menu items have actually got keyboard shortcuts, including the Alt F4 to close windows. So that didn't exist in Windows 1.0. And I think they've also changed the labels for the icon and zoom have been changed to minimize and maximize. So those are the main changes that we've got here. And it is possible now to actually move these. So you can see we can now move windows. And if we started another application, so you can see now that previously we had to just tile the windows, whereas now we can actually have them overlapping. And if we move this again, we can move things around. So that's Windows 2.0, and if we use Alt Tab to go back to our MS-DOS Executive, then if we want to exit, we can either use Alt S and then session. We could probably use Alt F4 as well. So then, as a final challenge, I decided to try and install Windows 3.0. Now, Windows 3.0 does work on the 8088. Windows 3.1 will not work on the 8088. So if we run this one now, it takes a little longer to start up. Okay, so I've speeded up the video here, so it won't have taken as long, but it took almost a minute or so to load this. But this will probably look a lot more familiar to people. So really, going from Windows 2 to Windows 3, then the Program Manager really did make a huge difference to the usability. And if we go back to the main item here, and this probably looks a little more familiar to people, the File Manager Still pretty much like the MS-DOS Executive, but rather than having to navigate to an executable using the MS-DOS Executive or File Manager, and if we maximize this, in fact, to get the control menu of a child window, it's actually a little difficult to do, but if we choose maximize, it's Alt and hyphen, Alt and minus sign. So you can see here that this is looking a lot more like what we'd understand, but obviously to try and find a program here to then run is a little more difficult than it would have been under MS-DOS Executive. So if we wanted to run calendar, for example, then we could find it from there. However, if we go back to Program Manager, this is a lot more like what you'd expect from Windows. The behavior is very similar. And we've even got on the games, if a little slow, we can actually run solitaire. Now the drawing of the cards here is actually quite slow, and I'm not going to try and run this because I'm not going to play it, just because without the mouse it's a little bit cumbersome to use. But it is possible to actually use all these versions of Windows just with the keyboard. It's just a little bit cumbersome, and you do need to know what some of these special Alt spacebar and Alt hyphen to get access to the control menus for the various windows. But you can see there we've got good old solitaire as we know and love. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break the video. I'll look into getting the Microsoft mouse drivers running. At the moment, when I try running the mouse drivers and I run any application, then the Breadboard PC just hangs. So I suspect there might be some problem to do with the mouse that I've got, the Microsoft mouse drivers, and also the BIOS configuration. There may need to be changes to the BIOS code to actually get this to work. But the fact that the Norton editor works using the Qt mouse driver then indicates that the hardware is probably okay. There's probably just a software issue somewhere along the lines. So thanks for watching. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, please hit subscribe, and if you could hit like as well if you found the content interesting. It just helps to make the videos available to more people. Thanks for watching.